Welcome back. Welcome back to session 8. I feel like one of those young scientists. I want to get up on the step and tell my story about the environment. I think everything has been done to capture your thoughts and your reflections, every tweet, blog, comment, in any ways possible, and to try to boil that out and summarize that into a few words so that we can map a way forward, so that we can continue to strengthen the science policy interface and really feed into the context of delivering for the 2030 agenda. This is the moment where we will first need to hear the summary of your words, and Jackie McGlade will share that with us. Then your chance to comment, and when you comment, I would encourage not only that you say something in the hall, but that if you write it down as well. You'll get copies, I think, are being circulated of the document. And then we'll have an opportunity to just pass the ball from Jackie to Farouk Ullah, who will give us a big science perspective from Future Earth. We'll close with Achim Steiner, and then we'll, for those who can join, be at the VIP reception, because there will be some things that will be shared there, and an award as well. And we'll have an unplugged session, and that's something that people look forward to, where they have a chance to just share and give feedback on what we've done here. So I'll pass over to Jackie to open up with a call for action.
Yes, well, thank you so much for both of us staying to the bitter end. And as I say, we will reward you by having a lovely reception again tonight. We do have a document. It's on its way, and I'm hoping it will make its way into the room soon. But in the absence of it being in the room, I've actually just made an overhead or two of the main points. What I'm not going to do right now, though, is to go through the details of the breakout sessions. Hopefully, when they arrive, you'll be able to see your session and make comments on that. And at the very end, of course, the 2 sessions today haven't made it yet into this summary. So we will be writing that overnight. The main reason is that this will go into bullet points into Achim's opening statement, his policy statement on Monday when we open UNEA. So what I would really value, and when you're talking to Tom, when he's moderating, and after Farouk's intervention as well, we're looking for those 5 points that we want Achim to say on Monday to report back from here. Now, I've got more than 5 points, I'll be very honest. It was very difficult to distill down. But I'll make those I'll make the pitch, and then I think it's not a matter of voting, but I think maybe through a dialogue very quickly, we can come down to what is it that we would like the Executive Director to report on. Okay? So this is an opportunity for you to really get your words into actions. Now, the necessary piece that comes at the beginning, there's a kind of preamble, is that we've convened more than 250 representatives from over 100 countries, so all that kind of blah blah goes in. Now, these are the key observations, and as I said, I try to really encapsulate many conversations into these sentences. So I do not intend at this point to negotiate text. We're going to do that all next week, probably into the very small hours. So this is not a negotiating moment, all right? And I've probably misspelt a few things and so on. But I'm just going to give you the key observations, if that's all right. And then hopefully, as I say, when the paperwork makes its way in here, you can scribble all over these and even delete the ones you think are not so essential. So in no particular order, but in some kind of order, I think we would start out by acclaiming that the challenges facing the world are complex and they can't be solved with simple solutions. Why do we bother saying that? Well, it's always worth rehearsing why it is that we're never going to be able to have one-on-one policies. So we need to kind of make that very clear, that you're not going to be having you're not going to have a one-stop shop. So that's the first one. The second one. It came out actually later on in the session today, in the morning, that we shouldn't just simply, the Frontiers report is very thematic, but essentially it looks at very topical issues and brings the science forward. But the observation that Peter Gluckman and others made in the room was we need to really understand why we have these continuing patterns of failure. They relate to unacceptable levels of inequality between rich and poor, ecological survival, famine, conflicts. There's a whole range of things. And that systemic nature of the continuance of them begs the question, well, we haven't really got to the root causes. So there really is a sense in which we need to understand what are the root causes and respond and look at those and address them. So that's the second point. Third point is one which was not specifically articulated, but it kind of was articulated. So we had a lot of discussion around interdisciplinarity, integration, and so forth. But the interdisciplinarity was always deployed towards the natural sciences and the social sciences. And on reflection, I was thinking that we should also ask for the same thing from the policy-making side of the machinery. Because right now, you often work with all the ministries in silos. You've got the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Energy, and so forth. So just as we're trying to get the interdisciplinarity going amongst the sciences, then I think the policy arenas themselves also need to be brought together in this same way. Now, to do that, we had several interventions that talked about the need for boundary organizations. And it's very, very clear that we're going to need them if we want to broach the interdisciplinarity challenge, to break down silos. So you can't often do it from within. You often need an organizational structure outside. The post-normal science, where uncertainty is high, lots at stake, we need to change the nature of the science policy dialogues. So how do we change that? Well, on the one hand, I think everybody here was clear that we need to bring the latest evidence, highlighting the limitations around our understanding, and on the other hand, accepting that decisions will be made under different levels of uncertainty. That for me is a kind of no-brainer, but it certainly came up in more than one side event, more than one breakout session, and again, it's all the way through some of the breakout text. Science policy interface needs to be mindful of the human side of things. Insofar as there was a wonderful statement made in the opening plenary by the minister from here of Environment, when she said that when she became a politician and a minister, she realized that the science was negotiable. And there was an immediate reaction from the floor. So that was sort of magnified more and more as we went into deeper discussions, to the point where it was clear that we're often not making decisions based on just science. It's about moral issues, moral values, and that hasn't really made it through because explicitly we try to put that under the table, implying that we have a heuristic logic to every decision that we make. And that truth-seeking doesn't necessarily lie only in the scientific community. So the idea that we have to be mindful of values and human context when we're trying to create this logic of policy making. This afternoon we heard about rapid growth of digitalization and its counterside. Yes, huge opportunities, opening up all kinds of ways of communicating and working with each other. But the other side, not quite the dark side in every case, but has a dark element to it, the loss of power. And this is really critical for us because, of course, nation states are the tax-raising bodies in many cases. So once you start undermining the possibility of creating that revenue, then many things happen, not least of which is illegal trade in wildlife, crime, and so forth. So this should not be underestimated. The geographical, the expert balance, the inclusive co-design process, this has been discussed on many levels in the GEO, but also throughout the whole 2 days. Who gets to be in the room? Who gets to actually put their evidence on the table? These are all extremely important and need a lot of thought in the construction of how we define knowledge. Who are the holders of knowledge? Is it practitioners? Is it researchers? Is it communities of practice that together somehow build up an understanding and experience? So the inclusivity of co-design of knowledge and therefore decision-making. The time lapse between knowledge and action needs to be shortened. How to do that? Well, there are many, many different ideas, but joining forces across national boundaries, promoting clearer interactions across the disciplines, there's a whole long list of things that we can do, but it's clear that we need to think about how we're going to shorten the time frame. And this is a classic example of an institutional approach where you buttress a debate between science and policy just before you go into a big policy debate and a big machinery. The question is it the right one? Now, Peter Gluckman, when he left, was absolutely delighted, and he wanted me to convey to you that he sees this as the beginning of exactly this process, and he says we should make this a routine, but next time there should be 3,000 people in the room, not 300. So he's laid down the challenge for himself, but he wants to bring the network of chief scientific advisors into here. I'm hoping we can link across to our academy partners, FutureArth. So we need to think about how we're going to do this and how we're going to mobilize it, but he strongly recommends that every time there's a UNEA, there must be a science policy discussion, a forum of some form before it. So I think that was very encouraging from his point of view. We didn't touch on it other than in the very clear opening session, but no voice providing scientific evidence should be left behind in the science policy. Is one of those kind of no-brainers, but then we come back to, yeah, but who's providing the scientific evidence? And we talked a little bit, we had a little bit this morning about vested interests and so on and so forth, and transparency. So one of the things in the the whole GEO process is really defining where science and evidence comes from and how to make it transparent and how to avoid, I won't say accusations, but the idea that someone comes just with a package that has got vested interests written from top to bottom. So we need to put in place much more rigorous procedures around the ethics and the substantive underpinning whereby we accept evidence in, or at least ring fence it, that it has a particular view associated with it. Now on the slide, there is an extra one. Effective global action needs to refer to effective domestic science. I actually deleted it. It was still in the slides. I wasn't so convinced that I heard that other than one intervention. So that one might be, it's not in the paper copy, but if any of you want to vote for it, please, don't hesitate. And then the last piece, of course, about capacity building and education, especially for women. We had many people really saying the turnaround, the turnkey is education for women. I'm a firm believer in that, of course. But how to actually foster science literacy and how to bring that into the kind of science policy process. And that's not only for the foreign affairs ministers and their teams, but it's also for people who are back home, some of the civil servants, even the statisticians, I should say. They really do need a lot more literacy about the broader picture, particularly for the environment. So those are the key observations that were drawn from the plenary debates and going through all the breakouts, so the more generic sort of ideas. And then, as I said, there's a series of pages of bullet points, which I haven't loaded up, but which you'll get, which talk about what are the key messages out of your breakout sessions. So I think I'd like to just leave it with that, and perhaps if, as the paper hasn't come, we could go back up just to remind everyone of the kind of picture that we were painting and see if I've captured what you thought happened, at least what you thought you heard, like the radio, and we can make notes to see whether we might have overseen, we've overlooked something, or whether you're broadly in agreement with some of these major points. So I'm going to hand back over to Tom, and I'm sorry you haven't got it in front of you, but I'm very happy to go between the screens if need be, if people want to do it that way.
We can start over here to the left.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I just wanted to reflect on the first point, which is around complex problems. In GEO5, we made the point very strongly in the policy chapter that there are still low-hanging fruit and simple solutions available, which a lot of countries are simply not implementing. And so I think it's probably needs to be nuanced to some extent in terms of not all problems are so complex that they require complex solutions.
Thank you very much. Yes, in the center here, and then we'll hear from you. Please.
Jem Woods, Imperial College. I just want to reinforce that because that really leapt out at me. I think there's a lot of global interactions that go on where people look at science and scientists and say, well, you're always saying it's so complex, and that's really self-reinforcing. But there are also a lot of solutions, the low-hanging fruit options. And so I think just the inclusion of the word all in that sentence, so not all are complex, or that there are other options available, would be
good. Point well taken here, right here.
Thank you very much. Alice Kaudia, Minister of Environment, Kenya, and also at African Center for Technology Studies. I would wish to vote for that statement, which is an outlier about the global science and the domestic science. I may change the word from domestic to national, because the reality is the national science, if it is not strong enough and rigorous enough, we would not be able to aggregate data at the global level and maintain accuracy and validity. We have very weak research institutions in terms of human resource capacity and also material capacity. By material capacity, I'm making reference to laboratories and accompanying inputs like reagents and so on. That is when you look at the national sciences. But when you look at the social sciences components, again, we still have institutional needs in terms of analytical frameworks, you know, the softwares that you need to buy to do the type of, you know, econometric analysis and so on. So we need to support national science systems to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you.
Again, point well taken. Rebecca?
Tom, can I just interfere?
Yes.
Could we ask the projectionist, if you don't mind, we won't put the people up, we'll keep the words up. Would that be easier? Yeah. So could you keep the screen on for me? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, and then we'll...
So I was going to do the same as the Minister, but from a different angle. I think it was Peter Gluckman who stated that well-coordinated domestic or national science was an essential part of ensuring global action, and that was through informing the diplomatic process, not just informing the national governments who are looking at their own interest, but also informing the negotiation process from each of the nations' perspectives. And for Future Earth, we're looking at how we can add value at the science policy interface, and very much feeling that the regional and the national level is where we need to support and facilitate and make sure that the science interacts with the policy processes. And then the second point was, again, taken up just before, about simplicity. In both the natural capital session and the session on sustainable consumption and production, these two concepts were seen to be unifying concepts in this sea of complexity that the SDGs are bringing up, but also the interlinkages of environmental issues. So while there are no simple solutions, there may be underlying concepts that can help to clarify and simplify and unify aspects of the complexity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Two important points. We'll hear from right here, and then we'll go back behind. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Alexander Brook, International Union of Forest Research Organizations. So first of all, thank you for an excellent summary. And I take it as very encouraging news that there is appetite of making the Science Policy Forum a permanent feature of the UNEA. In my view, this would really be an excellent kind of feature that could really add value to the UNEA in the future. I would like to perhaps add one point, and I believe it was no coincidence that we started the day looking at frontier issues and discussing emerging issues. And I believe that that is something that could perhaps also be added to the summary, that, you know, scientists, of course, do have a role in, you know, alerting policy and decision makers about issues that may not yet be prominently placed on the political agenda, but are nevertheless likely to have serious implications for the future. So perhaps this notion of science helping, you know, decision makers to identify and prioritize emerging issues could also be captured in the observations. Thank you.
Very good. It maybe was presumed, wasn't it? It's very good.
Yeah, actually, before,
to bring out.
as
Yes.
you asked the question, just could you maybe our dear volunteers, could you not do it one by one? Could you just give
hand them to
piles of
the
paper
row and they
out
can pass.
that would
Yes.
speed up the process? So let's be scientific about it. Okay, right.
We've got two gentlemen in the back. Yes. You first? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kami. I'm very happy with the third bullet, Jacques Andrenjan from Senegal. I'm working at the West African Development Bank.
Thank you.
I'm very happy with the third bullet, but I'll be happy to see the wording change, if possible, interdisciplinarity based on nexus approach. Because yesterday we dedicate a whole session dealing with nexus, to promote nexus. I think if we can highlight this concept in this K observation, it will be better for us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. My name is Babajide Allo. I'm from the Nigerian Academy of Science, as well as professor at the University of Lagos. I want to make comments on two aspects of the bullets we've seen there. There's the one which the Honorable Minister from Kenya had already alluded to, with respect to global action being based on tied as much as possible to domestic science. As we are not in a negotiation forum, it doesn't really matter to me whether we use domestic or we use national. However, the important point that needs to be brought out, and maybe we need to expand this sentence, is to say that we therefore need to empower or use experts at national level. And in this regard, it goes on for me to put on the table that for this process, now we need to start thinking of involving the national academies of science, or at the worst case, the regional academies of science. I want to, indicate openly that the Nigerian Academy of Science has not been too pleased with how much involvement we have had in terms of this process which we are seated in the last 2 days. We got the information late. We did not even know what role we were to play, whereas we thought that one would think that the national academies, or at worst case the national academies, ought to play a big role in this process of bringing science policy towards implementing the SDGs. The other point I want to make a comment on is bullet, I think it's number 7 or something like that, that has to do with policy relevance and legitimacy. Yes, maybe that's bullet 6. Policy relevance and legitimacy need to be embedded into science policy interface. That has been so well talked about at this meeting in the last 2 days, that it will be of no use if we generate any policies, and those policies we cannot mainstream them. And therefore it is so important that we need to find a means, or a mechanism, by which we can have geographical and expert balance in whatever design process we are having. And that's why I'm happy with the language, inclusive co-design process. Because, take it or leave it, Madam Chair, that how would the ministers, when we go to them next week, how will they take whatever document is coming from us? My minister, for example, will be asking, what is in this for me? How is this relevant to my country? And that's why if we need to expand the bullet 7 to indicate that developing countries will not be left behind in whatever we're doing with respect to science policy development, empowering developing countries to also be able to contribute to the science debate. All of those issues, I don't know whether this bullet sufficiently captures it, or we may need to add additional bullet indicating that we need to carry along not only national academies who have the the group of experts who can assist, but also that developing countries may need to be empowered to be able to contribute to the science debate globally. Thank you very much.
Very clear, very clear. Thank you so much. Let's go over here. Yeah, Peter.
Peter Denton from Canada. I was the person who identified himself as an endangered species in the opening session as a philosopher. And I'm really pleased to see bullet 5, and I know that you're going to have to reduce things to make it into Occam's statement. But it's really important, I think it's come up a number of ways in different discussions, both positively and as a sign of some conflict, that the values piece needs to be part of the science policy interface. So that to say that we need to be mindful of the language we're using, mindful of the contexts, mindful of the history of the terminology and the institutions, I think can only help, can't help but inform the debate in useful ways and create clarity so that we can identify the issues that we really have to resolve and not just get lost in the fog. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hear from our colleague from Latin America.
Yes, it's in regards to point 1 and what Peter was saying. The fact that we have proven technical solutions might not be the same as having low-hanging fruits. There are other complexities, social, economic complexities, political complexities, that make these problems still hard to solve, even though we understand them and we know that they're technical solutions. So not just present them as there are solutions to those simple problems, but to keep some tools on how to deal with those complexities in terms of social, cultural, and political issues.
Right. So link this low-hanging fruit to the tools that we need to do it. This is what you were saying. Good. Let's hear from here, and then I'll come back over there. Yes.
So the third bullet refers to a diagnosis and a solution. The diagnosis makes sense. The solution, I think, is artificially narrow. So if we're scientific about this, we should say maybe something more encompassing, like support a range of boundary crossing strategies. It may be that more boundary organizations will be counterproductive. That relates to a broader point, which is there's nowhere in this list is there a statement that we need to encourage more research about the sources of effectiveness at managing the science policy interface. And I'm sure we all accept that, but we should be explicit so that we're reflective and we take steps to do it better.
Great. So boundary crossing strategies and more effectiveness in the managing of that. We've got many more here, but if we can keep them brief and yes, please, and then we'll hear from you in the back.
Thank you, Tom. And I just have two general points. One general point, I just have a quick look of the first page, which is a general observation. I feel a little bit surprised. We have not mentioned SDG and 2030 agenda at all. It's not only the matter of the expression or presentation, because that really gave us a changed, the context, and also actually gave us the base to consider this as science policy. We should mention that. The second, about this first bullet point, try to think how to frame them or refer them a little bit positively. Right. Look a little bit negative. Two general points. Thank you.
The positive, constructive, and a good recommendation on the omission of SDGs. Yes, all the way in the back, and then we'll hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Isis Alvarez, Women's Major Group. So I heard in the Latin American report about indigenous knowledge systems, and I think it's the only one who actually mentioned it in the policy recommendations, and I think it should be actually very important because we are talking very much from the point of Western science, no? And when we are looking, for example, in the link with the resolutions in UNEP, we are seeing that there's this very strong push for natural capital back again, after years and years of debate on natural capital, which is actually stripping out of indigenous peoples of all other values that are embedded in the mere in the natural world, the natural resources, and not being mere natural capital for indigenous people. So indigenous knowledge systems really need to have a more important role in the whole recommendations, observations, I think.
Very good. Thank you very much. And right here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nicholas King, South Africa, and on the GO6 Science Advisory Panel. I think just come back to point 1, and our colleagues have mentioned already there are some simple solutions. I think it's not so much about whether they're complex or simple, but the need for systems thinking in coming to these solutions. That was a point Peter Gluckman made. So it's a systems paradigm approach rather than the reductionist siloed policy approach which we've utilized through the 20th century.
Right. Make that explicit, is what I hear you saying. Let's, over here, there were a few more. Yes.
You, Mary Muia, Soroptimist International Union of Kenya. I just want to reckon the 10th point on the first page, capacity building and education, especially for women, and fostering science literacy are critical. It's important that all the regional assessments have brought out the need to work with gender and to ensure that we support policies that are adaptive to each of the regions. So working with local initiatives, both at the grassroots level and also at the national level, will drive us towards achieving this. So I really want to support and vote for that.
Yes, so the gender, I'm making sure our colleagues are capturing. Yes? Thank you.
Ali from University of Tehran. Actually, for the first key observation, the challenges facing the world today are complex, but it's accomplished with a negative sentence.
Yes.
Yeah. You must say they need to integrate it and interdisciplinary solution or something like that.
So to say what, sorry?
They need integrated and interdisciplinary solution, something like that. Not what we are doing here. Yeah, if we can say that they don't have simple solution. But for some, there is also simple solutions. For some environmental issues, there is, as Indian guys, Khosla, yesterday mentioned that there is some simple solution for environmental crisis.
Okay, so we have to capture both of those in the spirit, if not the letter of the document.
Tom, just before you go on.
Is that clear?
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I just asked the ED to get here for 6:20, so I'm pacing it a little bit with Farouk so he can have his intervention as well.
Okay. So, yes, so I think we only have a couple more. It looked to me like there were a couple more hands up. Was there someone in the foreground here? Was it, okay, we've got, let me capture this man here and then you in the back and then you, and I think that's probably about it. Yes.
Thanks. I'm Nathan with the Children Youth Constituency. On point number 6 on digitalization. So we feel the intent that yes, digitalization is changing democracy is correct, but the example provided kind of the framing is sort of negative. And yes, it would be great if, especially we talked a lot about citizen science, if there could be a more positive aspect to democracy as well.
So Jackie, you spoke of the positive. We need to put it in, it sounds like. Yes. And in the back, yes. Keep it short, please.
It's going to be short. I apologize for coming in a second time, but I appreciate your giving me the chance. One key point that I see is missing in our summary is a necessity to make a statement for the forum to continue, as one. Secondly, that we probably need to start thinking of establishing an advisory board for driving science towards implementing the SDGs. I think it would be useful to go to the ministers, a statement recommending that we should consider establishing an advisory panel, whatever name we're going to call it, towards driving science for purposes of implementing the SDGs.
Okay, great. There are two good recommendations, and right in the front here. And I think unless someone absolutely is missing, critical point. We've got 3 more points.
Hi,
okay,
yeah, I was going to make a comment about the academies, but my colleague's already done that. But one thing I think is missing here is engaging more intelligently with social and using social and conventional media, so that we can frame some of these issues more constructively and more intelligently, more intelligibly to the public.
Yeah, all the way in the back, just very short. Yes.
3 short points. I'd like to join the voices on the comments on the first bullet on the reference to simple solutions. I think it's important to nuance that, because like even the summary of Dr. Ashok Khosla this morning actually captures that it's not the expensive complicated high-tech solutions that actually bring a long way. So I think that has to be corrected. The second point, the importance of really giving prominence to traditional and indigenous knowledge systems. I think some of the bullets actually imply that, the importance of making it relevant to people's lives and also human relations and all that. So all of that, and also the importance of science policy interface, recognizing the contributions of indigenous knowledge systems. I think IPBES has already settled that. And third point, I think we should not miss, even if the presentations are made in bullets, we should not miss the interlinkages among those. Because, like, for example, that point on no scientific voice should be left behind. I think that should be linked to the other points that concern about relevance, and also I think also that has to be nuanced much more to reflect that kind of engagement this morning on GMOs, for example, that the absence of consensus should not mean things that those that have the most prominent voices will be the ones that will be heard.
Right. We can agree to disagree.
Yes.
Yes. I think for everyone else, if you don't mind, we're going to have to close off. But that doesn't stop you from taking this document and writing all over it. Write whatever you like and where you think that there's a comment. As Jackie said, she's going to have to boil this down even smaller than it is at the moment. But there will be a second level document that will support all the points that you made. Thank you all very, very much for sharing your points as well. So bring those to the podium when you're ready. I'm going to turn it over to Farouk Ullah, who will give us some last reflections on big science. Can you get the presentation?
Thank you all very much. I'm better on my feet, so if you don't mind, I will stand for this. And I realize I'm the last panelists, although I represent the entirety of the panel for this session, so I will do my best. Just for clarity, I am the chair of the Engagement Committee of Future Earth. Future Earth is comprised at the global level of two functional committees, a science committee chaired by my counterpart Mark Stafford Smith, and the Engagement Committee now chaired by me. So I've been asked to do a few things. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Future Earth approach to engagement, which includes, of course, science policy interface issues. I'm going to give you some thoughts about how to, therefore, take this all forward and the way we are doing things in Future Earth, which I believe, as my colleague Rebecca from Future Earth pointed out, much of the activities we're undertaking address some of these problems and these challenges that you've now just highlighted. So I think there is a great deal of synergy to be had here between this forum, yourselves, and Future Earth, and we of course encourage you to come and speak to us and get involved in Future Earth. The first thing I'd like to start is something a bit provocative. I'm sorry that Sir Peter's not here. I think he hinted at this in his presentation yesterday. There is, of course, the science policy interface, but there is another very important interface that we have to consider, the science-society interface. And there's a lot of descriptions in Future Earth's underpinning models of understanding around this work of engagement is a basic shift from a traditional bipolar relationship of science to decision-making or to policy into something a little more triangular, a little more advanced. And I think that we have to bring this dynamic in. And I'll go into some specific reasons why in a moment. But really trying to go for a triangular approach of the science policy society interface. I believe that this will deeply enrich the conversations, come up with much better thought out, considered ideas, and eventually result in better, more thoroughly considered outcomes, which have, of course, buy-in of all stakeholders. And of course, this means moving from a linear sort of process of the scientific approach, where we start with funding and research and end up with some deliverables which are just pumped out into the atmosphere and hopefully picked up by somebody who will then apply it to their decision-making processes, to something that's far more collaborative and probably quite messy, as Sir Peter pointed out in his slide yesterday, with many lines going all over the place rather than a simple A to B, a linear approach. But there is some beauty within that chaos, and I hope that it will also result in some very deep benefits to us all. I mean, you can see, of course, some of the defining characteristics of this shift from what we call mode 1, for more consultation, to something far more collaborative. And this triangle, I hope, is something that will color all of our work going forward. This is underpinned by Future Earth's engagement principles. So Future Earth has recently published an engagement strategy. It's centered around these 4 principles. We've kept them quite basic in their instance, but if you look at the documentation, of course, we go into a lot more depth about how these things are meant to be applied. And of course, one of the big challenges are we cannot be prescriptive in terms of how we do engagement, how we better collaborate with others. Instead, we're going for a principles approach, which we hope then everybody will choose to apply in their own research, work, and projects. So, of course, being proactive around engagement is a prerequisite. Engagement needs to be flexible. Different projects have different scales and types and natures, and of course that in itself requires flexibility but also openness. Engagement, of course, must address any potential tensions, which I'll come on to in a moment, and vested interests, because there's inherent bias in doing this work in this way. And lastly, of course, all of this needs to be both inclusive and transparent. These are basic principles which underpin any form of stakeholder engagement. So there are a variety. Tom, can I just ask, how long do I have here? Should I just keep banging on until Akam shows up? Okay, all right, we'll go with that. Great. Okay. So within this whole engagement approach, there are both perceived and real risks and benefits. And these we have to very carefully understand them, because I believe that in understanding both of these risks and benefits, it will help us shape how we enhance the science policy interface, or of course the science policy society interface, as I like to call it. The first, of course, as I mentioned, is that in doing this, it opens itself up to undue influence or bias to the research project. We have to be quite careful about that. Of course, that leads to constriction on academic freedom. You simply can't just choose and do whatever you want. Our work around engagement is underpinned by what we affectionately call the co-X's. So co-design, co-production, and co-dissemination of knowledge. And of course, in doing that, you will potentially restrict your freedom of choice about what you choose to research and how you research it. There's a risk, of course, of public embarrassment. If you're opening up your research from the beginning, it means creating expectations. There's also a time commitment. It takes time to sort of speak to people in an honest and open way and significantly listen to what they have to say. And of course, there's a frustration of potential misuse of your knowledge. If you're sharing your knowledge in the whole process with others, they may use the outputs of that knowledge in different ways than what you intended. So you have to be careful about that. Oops. As I mentioned, of course, equally so, there are benefits, both real and perceived. We hope that, of course, resulting in openness will be greater attention and recognition of this work. Access to information will be enhanced as well. You may, of course, not even realize that certain stakeholder groups, private sector or NGOs, have certain reams of data that you may not have recognized as being available to you. Of course, the old adage of many heads are better than one, of course, will link to enhanced problem solving. And of course, it will foster innovation at the same time. You may, speaking to others and stakeholders, again, of course, traditional and indigenous knowledge is the key example, may result in finding new ways to tackle these problems. And of course, resulting in more practical use. And the last point, of course, is about learning. So with that in mind, I'm going to make some suggestions. I think we've heard a lot of calls here just now for the continuation of this. I think it's very exciting that we've had this inaugural science policy interface, and I hope inaugural will be the operational word in the sense that I hope this will continue. But I hope it also evolves, and of course very much in line with my triangle, it should evolve from a science policy forum into a true multi-stakeholder science policy society interface. I think there's many empty seats here which could be filled by many great minds from the stakeholder community. Again, academia is one aspect of it, but private sector, NGOs, civil society, grassroots movements should also be at this table. I think we have to be a little more demand-driven in planning and selecting the themes for this, and that links to this next point. We need to use the scientific knowledge that's present in this room to feed more into policy processes. For example, we have 20 draft resolutions on the cards for next week. If this was done a few months ago, we could have centered this entire discussion around those 20 resolutions and offered enhanced scientific rigor in designing those resolutions, which are going to be agreed next week. So, for example, I would say, can we align, instead of having this forum with UNEA, can it be aligned with the open-ended committee of permanent representatives where much of this debate is had, where much of the drafting of the resolutions happens, or even can we do this in non-UNEA years? We really, to understand how to do policy, advocacy and influence, you really have to understand that you can't show up the day before decisions are made and hope to have an impact. We have to do that 6 months to 12 months beforehand and back at 193 capitals. That's how advocacy is truly done. And of course, there needs to be better alignment with policy processes and windows, including other intergovernmental processes. I'm sorry, this is a negative example, but it's very important to realize. One of the overarching themes of UNEA, too, of course, is healthy people, healthy planet. Next week, we're here to talk about all of this work. At the same time, in Geneva, the World Health Assembly is going to be meeting there to talk about health in the 2030 agenda. So they won't, by definition, be here. Sorry, I'll wrap up. And lastly, I think we just need to, of course, bring in social sciences and traditional knowledges as being recommended greater into this thing. Of course, we're by nature driven by earth system sciences and the natural sciences. And lastly, focus more on the follow-up and new initiatives. So where do we go from here? This has been a very rich 2 days in discussions. How do we take this forward? How do we have real-world impact? I'll leave it there as Achim is here, and just say thank you very much, and I hope we can work together going forward. Just very lastly, Future Earth has a brochure if you're interested in learning more about it, and my colleagues Hannah and Rebecca are there, so please come see us in the next few days, and we'll happily tell you more about what we're doing and how you can be involved. Thank you.
Right, so we've just sort of come to the end of this session, and I thought you would really be interested, and this is also for Achim and for Ibrahim, who are joining us here on the podium. A special honour to have both of you here, it's great. We've been tracking web intelligence on UNEA, and so it's the web intelligence that you can see up here is the software tools that we showed you earlier. So since March, we've seen just this massive increase in interest on UNEA, and these are the topics that people are talking about in relation to UNEA. So this is across all the news, the social media, and the environmental organisations. And you can see how it's all linked geographically to, obviously, Kenya, but there's still a tail from Paris. There's still sort of fragments of previous conversations that have been going on. But it's really increasing and going up. So we're really making a mark that UNEA is the place to discuss some of these huge issues that you can see in the list here. So I hope that the next time we run this, science policy is one of the big hitters. So thank you very much. And I'm back over to our moderator. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's remarkable. So the world is here with us. Just to end this session and to get some final remarks. We have Achim Steiner, Executive Director of UNEP, and we have Ibrahim Tian, the Deputy Executive Director. I'm delighted that you are here to close this wonderful session.
Thank you very much, Tom and Jackie, and to all of you. I think the last thing you would probably want right now is an executive director's speech, so let me put your minds at rest. I've been trying to digest what you have already been articulating in the call for action, and where, in just 2 days, which is an insanely short period of time in which to try and cover a subject such as science policy, both adequately and also in a way that would leave you not only intellectually satisfied, but perhaps more importantly, what Farouk was alluding to just now, satisfied that there is consequence to the deliberations you've had here. Now, had we just thought of the Science Policy Forum as a kind of decoration a couple of days before UNEA, then indeed you would have reasons to be worried, because, as you rightly pointed out, science is not converted into action policy, whether advocacy or otherwise, in a matter of a few hours and some document making it before the United Nations Environment Assembly. To me, and I hope you have sensed that, and to us in UNEP, the convening of the Science and Policy Forum is actually trying to send a message that we're opening the next chapter. I was just talking with Deborah from The New Scientist about the oscillating relationship between scientists and UNEP over its 44-year history. There was a time when this institution was occupied by scientists, Some would say, well, today it's occupied by bureaucrats. Well, neither of it is actually the truth. We had the first generation of environmental experts very much coming out of the scientific world and helping us to begin to build a United Nations Environment Programme. Over time, we also began to learn that, trying to provide a multilateral organization with its interface, its programmatic and political management, its operational management, required a mix. And increasingly also not people who would come and operate within UNEP as a platform from where you could advance a particular aspect, be it biodiversity, terrestrial, marine, atmospheric science, but rather to mature a United Nations Environment Programme into being the institution that picks up from where science often leaves off, namely the point at which information analysis findings are presented to society, and it's very often still in the mode of, well, here it is, take it or leave it, and if you don't understand it, it's your problem. Our role today as the United Nations Environment Programme is to sit at the center of that space, as I alluded to, where science emerges and policies become actionable, and to also provide a safe space in which nations, very unequal nations, rich and poor, nations that have hundreds of thousands of scientists, nations that may only have a few hundred scientists, are able to frame legitimate and equitable responses in a very unequal world. UNEP's role, I think, in the year 2016 is very much defined by that journey. And I was struck when I read also in the notes that you spoke about boundary organizations. It may stretch your imagination at this point if I were to say to you that my vision for UNEP and that environmental community that it assembles is ideally to be a boundary organization. Boundary between science, knowledge, policy, practice, but also, I believe, a boundary organization in what many of you have repeatedly spoken to during these last 2 days. Interdisciplinary, by definition, multi-stakeholder, by necessity, and above all, accepting that what we are trying to provide the world with is not singular responses, but the systemic capacity to respond. And if I take much of what you have articulated in your summary, then I hope that what you will leave the Science Policy Forum with, and perhaps those of you who will stay for parts of UNEA next week, is a sense of possibility. Great things are not invented by resolution or by decree or by meetings, but they are fostered, they are enabled, they are nurtured and cultivated. The decision to have the first Science Policy Forum of our new age in UNEP being convened this week was to send an unmistakable signal into the scientific community that it is worth your while to look at the United Nations Environment Assembly as an emerging critical platform for that which many of you at the end of the day believe your work is intended to achieve. It was also to send an unmistakable signal to the community of nations and governments and ministers who will assemble here next week that the foundation of this program, its authority, its legitimacy and its relevance remain firmly grounded in the world of science, empirical work, and not to dictate, either through ideological perspectives, geopolitical interests, what the answer is that each nation and country will have to find in its own processes of public consultation. I also hope that you will carry back into your community of scientists and those who work at the science policy interface a strong message of opportunity. UNEA, just because it has been born, has met once and will now convene for the second time, does not automatically become some remarkable new body that can transmogrify science into extraordinary policy outcomes. It is only when it is invested in, believed in, supported, nurtured and sustained that it will, I hope, over time, provide what the world in its own imperfect way articulated in Rio when it strengthened and upgraded UNEP. Recognizing the centrality of environment, expressed through many different scientific disciplines, realities, as central to what happens next to humanity. And in that sense, UNEA remains both an assembly of the world's nations and all those who play a role in this environmental and sustainable development arena, but also an advocacy body. The role of an Environment Assembly in the United Nations is far from being one that can simply contribute to the discussion. We will have to continue to push boundaries. We will have to continue to challenge paradigms. We will have to continue to challenge national interests, and sometimes we will have to move into the uncomfortable zone where a United Nations Environment Programme steps outside the boundaries of simply following instructions. Many of the great successes of the environmental community, science, policy, practice, advocacy, has been in challenging established wisdom. And I often have this challenge, being a UN Under-Secretary General, and therefore, in a sense, a civil servant, to have governments believe in the role also of a secretariat or indeed of the United Nations Environment Programme, moving beyond where countries may believe the lowest common denominator or so-called consensus is. I often have to remind people that it was governments who legislated, defended and transacted slavery. It was a government that enacted, legislated and practiced apartheid. If the United Nations had not been there, or if that common goodwill of leaders in civil society or in nations that are willing to challenge that established paradigm had not risen to the challenge, would we still have slavery? Would we still have an apartheid system? Well, who knows? But that is also the challenge of our time right now at the early part of the 21st century. Our grandchildren, somewhere around 2100, will ask many hard questions of their parents and of history books. How on earth did things happen the way they did when so much was already known, so much could have been done? And you know, sometimes the multilateral system of the United Nations is viewed as essentially unable to advance agendas. It's true in many respects, because we are, at the end of the day, an amalgamation of sovereign national states willing to provide mandates, authority, and sometimes the ability of our system to help the world move from the present to the future. But for those of you who think that just because there are many failures, the United Nations, the multilateral system, that process of trying to reconcile 7 billion people's views and interests is a failure, I would say after 10 years at the helm of UNEP, you would be very wrong. Look back to 2015, look back to 20 years ago, and perhaps in tracing the story of some of our most difficult challenges, and you recognize with perspective how important it is what we together can do. And by saying together, I do not mean the people who work in the UN or only the delegates who come to the General Assembly, the United Nations Environment Assembly, but what we can do with the institutions and the platforms that we can use. Farouk, you made some very practical suggestions, and I think I was just talking to Ibrahim, just catching your last 3 minutes already gave 5 very practical ideas, and I won't take your time now, but I think for us, if you leave from here and even in 2 months' time would not write back to us and say, actually, it wasn't really worth my time, then I can assure you that the next Science Policy Forum will happen, that it will be more profound, even more representative, and perhaps timed in a different chronology in order to have a much more substantive impact on the global agenda. This is not to say that science hasn't built much of what will be discussed next week here. In fact, you will see a plethora of UNEP reports, assessments, having been presented to our member states over the last year. But I think if you are ready to buy into this next generation of the science policy interface through also this platform called UNEA, then I am certain that member states, my successor, and all those who actually make UNEP's work possible would not only be delighted but actually believe in it more than you might feel at this point. So with these few reflections, thank you once again for having taken the time, made the journey here, have been part of a conversation, sometimes perhaps disjointed, at other moments remarkably aligned, but above all enabling me next week to stand before the world's environment ministers and say, this institution is rebuilding and evolving its relationship with the scientific community in a way that echoes to the challenges of our time. And I'm sure in the summary that Jackie and you will provide me with in terms of what I should highlight, you will find great resonance. To you, Jackie, to the team, to all those who have enabled us to make this happen in a very short period of time, and above all to you, thank you so much. I'm sure somewhere in the future, some of the discussions that happened here in the last 2 days will be remembered for more than just minutes or summaries of the meeting. Have a wonderful evening. I know there is still further events planned and great things happening. And to those of you who have a little bit of time, enjoy Kenya. It's a beautiful country. It's a little bit wet, but it's an amazing place to discover things that we discuss in this conference room. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akim. And I understand Ibrahim will be joining us upstairs for the reception. I invite everyone to join. We'll have a chance to recognize another person who has contributed greatly to science. And we'll see all of you there as well. We'll have a chance, as I said, to have a little bit of an unplugged session where people can also reflect, respect, and maybe share gratitude. So thank you all very much, and Akim as well. And we will now go upstairs. Yes?
Same place as last evening.
Same place as last evening. Thank you all very much.